There's a strange moment that happens in life that most people don't talk about. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with some clear signal telling you what to do next. It feels more like a quiet realization, like something inside you has been waiting for your attention for a long time, and now it's getting harder to ignore. Not urgent in a panic sense, but persistent. You keep telling yourself you'll deal with it later. You'll figure things out once life slows down, once you feel more ready, once things make more sense. But something about that delay doesn't feel honest anymore. And that's where this starts. Because this isn't about rushing your life or forcing decisions. It's about recognizing when later quietly turns into avoidance, and when avoidance starts holding you back from becoming who you already feel yourself becoming. The subtle weight of waiting too long. Most people think delay looks like laziness, but that's not what it feels like from the inside. From the inside, it feels like thinking too much, like replaying options over and over again until everything becomes unclear, like wanting to move forward but also wanting to be absolutely sure before you do. And that need for certainty can quietly freeze you. You start telling yourself things like, I just need more time, or I'll do it when I feel fully ready. But if you're honest, that feeling of being fully ready almost never arrives. Instead, what grows is a kind of mental pressure. You notice it in small ways. You hesitate more. You second-guess simple decisions. You feel slightly disconnected from your own direction, even if everything on the outside looks fine. It's not because you don't know what matters to you. It's because you've been postponing acting on it. And the longer that goes on, the heavier it starts to feel. Not because something bad is happening, but because something meaningful is being ignored. When growth feels like discomfort, not clarity. One of the most misunderstood parts of personal growth is this idea that clarity comes first. It usually doesn't. More often, what comes first is discomfort. You start feeling out of place in environments that once felt normal. Conversations don't hit the same. The way you spend your time starts to feel slightly off, even if you can't explain why. It's not dramatic enough to force change immediately, but it's consistent enough that you can't fully relax into your old patterns anymore. And that's where a lot of people pause. They assume something is wrong. They try to fix the discomfort instead of understanding it. But that discomfort is often a signal, not of failure but of transition. You're not losing your direction. You're outgrowing an older version of it. The problem is, if you keep delaying your response to that feeling, you stay in between two identities for too long. And that in-between space can feel confusing, even exhausting. The cost of staying mentally stuck. There's a difference between being patient and being stuck. Patience has a sense of movement behind it. Even if things are slow, you feel like you're progressing, learning, adjusting. Being stuck feels different. It feels like you're circling the same thoughts, like you're aware of what needs attention but keep finding reasons to push it aside. And over time, that creates a quiet kind of frustration. Not the kind you express loudly, but the kind that shows up as restlessness, lack of focus, or even low motivation. Because deep down, your mind knows you're capable of more than what you're currently allowing yourself to step into. And that gap between what you know and what you're doing starts to drain your energy. This is why delay isn't neutral. It slowly changes how you see yourself. Not in a dramatic way, but in small internal shifts. You trust your instincts a little less. You hesitate a little more. You start questioning your own timing. And that's where it becomes important to pause and ask yourself something real. Not what's the perfect move, but what have I been avoiding that I already understand on some level? Why you keep telling yourself, not yet? There's always a reason. Sometimes it's fear, but not the obvious kind. It's not fear of failure as much as it is fear of change. Because change, even positive change, means letting go of something familiar. It might mean letting go of how people currently see you, letting go of routines that feel safe, letting go of a version of yourself that you've spent years building. And even if you know you've outgrown it, there's still a part of you that hesitates. So you delay. You tell yourself you'll think about it later. You distract yourself with smaller tasks. You stay busy enough to avoid making the bigger decision. But here's the part most people don't realize. The longer you delay something meaningful, the more complicated it starts to feel. Not because it actually is more complicated, but because your mind builds more scenarios, more doubts, more what-ifs around it. And suddenly, something that was once simple becomes something that feels overwhelming. The shift from passive thinking to intentional action. At some point, there's a quiet shift that needs to happen. Not a dramatic life overhaul, not a sudden extreme decision. Just a shift in how you respond to yourself. Instead of waiting for perfect clarity, you start allowing small, intentional movement. You stop asking, "Am I 100% ready?" and start asking, "What's one honest step forward?" And that changes everything. Because action, real grounded action, creates clarity in a way thinking never can. It gives your mind something real to respond to, instead of something imagined. And more importantly, it starts rebuilding trust in yourself. Not because everything works perfectly, but because you're no longer ignoring what matters to you. Becoming someone who moves when it matters. This is where identity starts to shift. Not through big declarations or dramatic changes, but through consistent alignment. You begin to see yourself differently. Not as someone who waits for the perfect moment, but as someone who responds when something feels important. That doesn't mean rushing. It means respecting your own awareness. When something keeps coming back to your mind, an idea, a change, a direction, it's usually not random. It's something asking for your attention. And becoming someone who listens to that, who moves with it, even in small ways, builds a completely different kind of confidence. Not loud confidence, but steady, grounded self-trust. You don't need everything figured out. A lot of delay comes from the belief that you need a full plan before you begin. But real growth doesn't work like that. You don't see the entire path before you take the first step. You see the next step, and then the next one reveals itself after that. And yes, that can feel uncertain. But staying in place because you can't see everything clearly, that creates a different kind of uncertainty, the kind that lingers. Moving forward, even imperfectly, replaces that with experience. And experience is always more useful than overthinking. The quiet decision that changes everything. At the end of all this, there isn't a dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. There's just a decision. A quiet one. You decide to stop delaying the things that matter to you. You decide to trust that you can figure things out as you go. You decide that your growth is worth acting on, even if it feels unfamiliar. And once that decision is made, things begin to shift. Not instantly, not perfectly, but steadily. If something has been on your mind consistently, if there's a direction, a change, or even a simple step that keeps coming back to you, it might be worth paying attention to that. Not because you're being pushed, but because you're becoming more aware. And awareness, when ignored for too long, turns into frustration. But when acted on, even in small ways, it turns into progress. If this connected with something you've been feeling lately, take a moment to reflect on it. You don't need to explain everything, just notice what stood out to you. And if you want, share your thoughts below. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step toward understanding it more clearly. The moment you realize you've changed, there's a specific kind of awareness that doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, through small realizations you almost ignore at first. You notice your reactions are different. Things that used to trigger you don't hit as hard. Conversations you once enjoyed now feel repetitive. Even the way you spend your free time starts to shift. At first, it's easy to brush it off. You tell yourself you're just in a different mood. Maybe you're tired. Maybe it's just a phase. But then it keeps happening. And eventually, you're forced to recognize something simple but uncomfortable. You're not the same person you used to be. And that realization can feel strangely isolating. Not because anything is wrong, but because the version of you that once fit perfectly into your environment is no longer fully aligned with it. Why outgrowing your old life feels so confusing. People don't talk enough about how disorienting growth can be. You think becoming more aware, more focused, more intentional would feel empowering all the time. But sometimes, it just feels like you don't fully belong anywhere. You're not who you used to be, but you're also not fully who you're becoming yet. So you exist in this middle space. And in that space, even simple things can feel complicated. You might find yourself pulling back from certain friendships, not out of dislike, but because the connection no longer feels natural. You might question routines that once gave you comfort. You might even feel a little disconnected from your own habits, like you're watching yourself go through motions that don't fully represent who you are anymore. That's not confusion in the negative sense. That's adjustment. But if you don't recognize it for what it is, you might start thinking you've lost direction, when in reality, you're redefining it. The tension between comfort and honesty. There's always a moment where you feel the tension. On one side, there's comfort, familiar routines, predictable outcomes, the version of your life that doesn't require much explanation. On the other side, there's honesty. And honesty doesn't always feel comfortable. It asks questions you can't easily ignore anymore. Questions like, is this still right for me? Am I staying here because it makes sense or because it's easy? Have I been putting this off because I'm unsure or because I'm avoiding the effort of change? These aren't dramatic questions, but they're powerful because once you start asking them honestly, it becomes harder to stay in situations that don't feel aligned. And that's where delay often shows up again. You know something needs to shift, but you hesitate to act on it. Not because you don't care, but because you understand that once you start moving, things will begin to change for real. When you stop needing external validation, one of the clearest signs of internal growth is subtle. It's when you start relying less on external feedback to make decisions. Before, you might have needed reassurance. You wanted confirmation that you were doing the right thing. You looked for approval, even in small ways. But now something shifts. You still value input, but you don't depend on it the same way. You begin to notice that the answers you're looking for are already forming internally. And that can feel unfamiliar at first, because it means taking responsibility for your own direction. It means trusting your judgment without constant reassurance. And that level of self-trust doesn't come from thinking. It comes from acting, reflecting, adjusting, and continuing. That's why delay becomes more noticeable at this stage. Because when you already sense what feels right, postponing action starts to feel like you're ignoring yourself. The hidden fear of getting it right. Most people think delay comes from fear of failure. But there's another layer that's less obvious. Sometimes, the hesitation comes from the possibility that things might actually work. Because if they do, your life changes. Your responsibilities change. Your identity changes. And that means you can't go back to the version of yourself that was still figuring things out. There's a certain comfort in staying in preparation mode. It allows you to imagine possibilities without fully stepping into them. But stepping forward, even in a small way, removes that distance. It makes things real, and reality requires commitment. That's why moving forward isn't always about building courage. Sometimes it's about accepting that you're ready for more than you've been allowing yourself to handle. Learning to move without over-explaining yourself. Another shift that happens quietly is this. You stop feeling the need to justify every decision. In the past, you might have explained yourself more. Why you're changing direction, why you're stepping back from something, why you're choosing one path over another. But as your awareness grows, you start realizing something important. Not everyone needs to understand your process. And more importantly, not everyone will. That doesn't make your decisions wrong. It just means they're personal. And when you stop over-explaining, you free up a lot of mental energy. Energy that was previously spent trying to make your choices make sense to everyone else. Now, that energy can be used for something more useful, actually moving forward. The discipline of following through. Awareness is powerful, but without follow-through, it becomes frustrating. Because you start seeing patterns clearly, but nothing changes. And that gap between awareness and action can feel heavy. This is where discipline comes in, but not in the strict, rigid way people often think about it. Not forcing yourself into extreme routines or unrealistic standards, but simple, consistent follow-through. If something matters to you, you give it time. If something needs attention, you don't keep postponing it indefinitely. You build a habit of responding to your own priorities. And over time, that habit becomes part of your identity. You become someone who doesn't just think about growth, but participates in it, redefining what progress actually looks like. A lot of delay comes from unrealistic expectations. People think progress has to be obvious. Big changes, clear results, immediate improvement. But real progress is often quieter than that. It looks like making a decision you've been avoiding, having a conversation you've been putting off, changing a small habit that didn't feel right anymore, saying no when you would have said yes before. These aren't dramatic moments, but they matter because they represent alignment. And alignment over time creates real change. The shift from thinking about your life to living it. At some point, something clicks. You realize you've spent a lot of time thinking about your life, analyzing it, questioning it, trying to understand it from every angle. And while that reflection has value, it's not the same as living. Living requires movement. It requires participation. It requires stepping into situations where you don't have complete control or certainty. And yes, that comes with discomfort. But it also comes with experience. And experience is what shapes clarity, confidence, and direction in a real way. You're allowed to start before you feel ready. This is something that takes time to fully accept. Because everything around you often reinforces the idea that you should wait until you feel completely prepared. But in reality, readiness is built through action, not before it. You don't wake up one day feeling perfectly ready for something new. You step into it and gradually become ready as you go. And once you understand that, delay starts to lose its hold on you. Because you're no longer waiting for a feeling that may never arrive. You're creating momentum instead. If you've been noticing these shifts, the changes in how you think, how you respond, what you value, take a moment to recognize that. Not as something confusing, but as something meaningful. Because growth doesn't always feel like progress in the moment. Sometimes it just feels like things no longer fit the way they used to. And that's not a problem to fix. It's a signal to pay attention to. If any part of this felt familiar, take a second to sit with it. No pressure to act immediately, just awareness. And if you want to share what's been on your mind lately, you can. Sometimes hearing your own thoughts written out makes things clearer than you expect, when you realize it's not about motivation anymore. At a certain point, you stop waiting to feel motivated, not because motivation doesn't matter, but because you've experienced how unreliable it can be. Some days you feel clear, focused, ready to move. Other days, that feeling disappears completely. And if your actions depend on that feeling, your progress becomes inconsistent. So something shifts. You begin to rely less on how you feel in the moment and more on what you've already decided matters to you. That's a different level of awareness. Because now you're not asking yourself, do I feel like doing this today? You're asking, is this still important to the person I'm becoming? And when the answer is yes, you move anyway. Not perfectly, not with full confidence every time, but with enough consistency that your life starts to reflect your intentions, not just your moods. The identity shift that changes everything. Real change doesn't come from forcing better habits. It comes from becoming someone who naturally aligns with them. At first, it feels like effort. You have to remind yourself. You have to push through resistance. You have to stay aware of your patterns. But over time, something deeper happens. You stop negotiating with yourself as much. You stop going back and forth between I should and maybe later. Because your actions start matching your identity. You're no longer trying to become disciplined. You're becoming someone who follows through. You're no longer trying to find direction. You're becoming someone who responds to clarity when it shows up. And that shift, subtle as it is, changes how you experience everything. Letting go of the version of you that keeps delaying. There's a version of you that got comfortable waiting. Waiting for the right moment, waiting for better conditions, waiting to feel more certain. And that version of you served a purpose at some point. It kept you safe. It helped you avoid unnecessary risks. It gave you time to think. But you're not in that same place anymore. And holding onto that pattern now doesn't protect you. It limits you. So at some point, you have to make a quiet decision. Not to reject your past, but to stop letting it control your present. You don't need to rush into something extreme. You just need to stop defaulting to delay. Even in small ways. Even in decisions that seem insignificant. Because those small moments are where identity is actually shaped. The power of responding in real time. There's something powerful about responding to your own awareness immediately. Not recklessly, but honestly. When you notice something that needs attention, you give it attention. When something feels misaligned, you don't keep ignoring it. When an idea keeps coming back to you, you explore it instead of pushing it aside again. That kind of responsiveness builds momentum. And momentum changes how everything feels. You go from feeling stuck in your own head to feeling engaged with your life again. And that engagement creates energy. Not forced energy, but natural energy that comes from movement. You're not behind, you're just being called to act. A lot of people carry this quiet pressure that they're falling behind. That they should have figured things out by now. That they've taken too long. But most of that pressure isn't coming from reality. It's coming from comparison. And comparison distorts timing. Your process isn't supposed to look like anyone else. Your decisions aren't supposed to follow someone else's timeline. But there is one thing that matters. When you become aware of something meaningful, what do you do with it? Do you act on it? Or do you keep delaying it? Because that choice, repeated over time, is what actually shapes your direction. The version of you that moves differently. Imagine a version of yourself that doesn't overthink every step. Not because they have all the answers, but because they trust themselves enough to figure things out along the way. They still think carefully. They still reflect. But they don't stay stuck in that phase. They move. They adjust. They learn in real time. And because of that, they grow faster, not in a rushed way, but in a grounded, steady way. That version of you isn't far away. It's built through small decisions, moments where you choose action over delay, clarity over avoidance, honesty over comfort. This is where things quietly change. There's no big announcement when this shift happens. No dramatic turning point. Just a series of small, intentional decisions. You start doing what you said you would do. You start addressing what you've been avoiding. You start trusting your own direction a little more each time you follow through. And slowly things change. Not all at once, but enough that you begin to notice it. You feel more grounded, more focused, less scattered, because your actions and your awareness are finally working together instead of pulling in different directions. If you've made it this far, there's probably something in your life that's been asking for your attention. Not loudly, but consistently. A decision, a shift, a step forward that you've been thinking about for a while. You don't need to turn your entire life upside down. You don't need a perfect plan, but you do need honesty with yourself. Because the longer you ignore something that matters, the heavier it becomes. And the moment you start responding to it, even in the smallest way, that weight begins to lift. Take a moment right now and be real with yourself. What is one thing, just one, that you've been putting off even though you already know it matters? Don't overthink it. Don't try to make it perfect. Just identify it. And then make a simple decision. You're not going to delay that anymore. Not next week, not when you feel ready. You're going to take one step toward it. Even if it's small, even if it's imperfect. Because that's how everything changes. Not through waiting, but through movement. If this spoke to you, share what that one step is for you. Not for validation, but for clarity. Sometimes saying it out loud is the moment things stop feeling distant and start becoming real.